for the warning. Okay. Good morning. Good morning. I'll get it. Sure. Great,
My
Papa.
son.
Nice day, huh?
Not bad, yeah.
Not too bad.
We're in the 70s today, this week.
Is it? Oh, that's
this
great.
week, yeah.
Get the good. You got the good stuff. Morning, everybody. We'll do a 1-minute warning. Finish up your little conversations. He's running around somewhere. I think actually he went back to a classroom to talk to somebody. All right, we'll get started soon. Stop your chit-chat, Nawana. The coffee? No. Sound like a comedian trying to... a comedian from Oklahoma trying to imitate a New Yorker. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I think everybody else in the United States actually has discernible accents, but people in the Midwest just talking.
Yeah.
Now that is
No,
not.
that's not Midwest, yeah. Every now and then you'll say something differently and oddly, and I'll say, oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. The Midwest accent, it's like the middle.
Now we definitely have our own quirks. Like, for some reason, people from the Midwest, they say "oops" a
Oops.
lot. Like if they bump into someone.
All right, guys, let's get started. You know that we're past time when we start talking about different accents, and there we go. Good morning. Man, you know you're not a big draw when your own mom crawls in 5 minutes late. She was helping someone in the office, I'm sure. Oh, the what class? Oh, okay. The baby class. So we got the baby teachers in here today. That's great. So, what is it? Daylight? Now it's back to standard time, right? Daylight. That's not daylight savings now, right? It's daylight savings. Really? Okay. Okay, so we're on daylight savings now? I thought that was over the winter. I don't know about that. Anyway, either way, time change. So this is the time we lose an hour's sleep, right? Spring ahead, so we lose that hour. I'm wondering if you have any stories about times when you or maybe someone you knew really made a big mistake after a time change because they didn't realize the time change, either an hour back or an hour ahead. Any interesting mistakes?
Well, I did it last week.
Ah, she did it last week. That's awesome.
No, well,
She did the time change last week.
no, because I'm sitting in the room waiting for Vivian to come get me, and I fell asleep for the hour that I lost.
Yeah. Well, I hope you gave her a hard time about being late.
No, she wasn't late.
No, I know. Okay, that's a good one. So it's something we could all relate to a little bit. Maybe you were ready, but you were ready a week early. So that's a good one. Thanks for sharing that one. Somebody else, time change mishap. Yes.
Decades ago, Mark and I were on a cross-country camping trip, and it was summertime, so we were on daylight savings time. We were camping in Arizona. We found that later on doesn't observe daylight savings time. And so we showed up at church on Sunday an hour early, and the doors were locked. It was a smaller church, and we just left thinking, oh, how sad. This is the church that's shuttered its doors and is closed. And, so we worshiped in a tent or something, but
That's funny.
to find out later that we were an hour off from the rest of us.
That's a good one. I knew those stories were out there. Sean. Oh, this is great. Our military is an hour off. Go ahead.
Since it's daylight savings, but during fall sale for school, I had to pick up a computer for a friend, and I was out of town. I was traveling in Kansas City, and it was Sunday evening, so I was going to just grab the laptop and then go to worship Sunday evening at a congregation nearby. But the lines were so long, I was like 30 minutes late, and in my mind I'm thinking, well, I'll just sneak in the back of the congregation and at least get 30 minutes worth of good, good service or whatever. No one will notice. I'll just sneak in the back. I don't want to be embarrassed or embarrass anyone, because a lot of people, they think that they're embarrassing someone if they come in late. So I was like, I'm just going to go in. It happened to be an African American congregation. It was extremely obvious that I was not there for the first half. I was there for the last 20 minutes. And of course they had to welcome me, and I stood up and they all cheered for me. So I felt very embarrassed I came in late when it was obvious, because I was in line for a long time. But they were very appreciative, and the singing was beautiful, and it was just an uplifting experience. So if you're late, just go.
Just go. Anybody else? Good story thrown off by a time change. Mine is kind of related. Bill and I, my brother, used to take trips once a summer and do a run, like a 5 or a 10K, somewhere else in the country. So it was an excuse to take a trip, and we did it to go on to do this run. And this is pre-internet, so you'd buy a Runner's World magazine, you'd look in the back, pick one, a place you wanted to go, and kind of you signed up over mail, you sent your thing in. So there wasn't a lot of back and forth communication, and we'd do it a couple months ahead of time, so we signed up for this one. And by the time we got there, it was, they had canceled it, because we hadn't talked to anybody. It was just a mail-in kind of thing. Oh, you didn't know? We announced it in church, in Kentucky. And no, we didn't hear about that, thanks. So we pivoted, and there was another run that weekend in town. And so we signed up for that one, and we stayed in Kentucky, and I didn't realize that somewhere around there is a time change. Like, what's that called? What's that? Yeah, a time zone change, like right there. So our hotel was in a different time zone than the run, even though the run was only 20 minutes away from our hotel. So, we're just getting up, taking our time, cruising over to the run, And like we get there, we think we're like 45 minutes early, and the gun goes off. It's like, what? So we jumped in, but so kind of a funny one there. So it's funny how things can be different than what you think. Like all those stories revolve around a certainty that you knew what time it was, you knew where you were at, but you were certain enough, but the reality was a little different. And certainly, I think there's a application for that for our Christian lives, and we'll talk about that a little bit. This is week 2, and this will probably be the last week of this topic, but we're talking about kings and suffering. And there are two things that don't seem to go together, but, and I'll do a lot of recap kind of stuff this week if you weren't here last week, but they don't seem to go together. But whoever you make in charge of your life has a lot to do with the amount of joy and suffering that you have, right? And so we don't have a king, so it's kind of weird. But somebody's running, directing your life. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's God. Maybe sometimes you let God do it. Maybe other times you don't trust him and you take it back. It's not a good one to let him be control of. So we're talking about suffering as related to who's in charge of your life. Okay, so as Christians, and most of us here, God's in charge, whether you give him the reins or not. I mean, he's running this show. So the suffering that as humans we're all going to endure, whether you're a Christian or not, Solomon says the rain falls on the just and the unjust. So we're all under this veil of there's going to be suffering in our lives. God tells us, and this is a little bit review of last week, God tells us that, well, okay, you're going to have this suffering, whether, no matter what, wherever you live, whatever your belief system, here's this suffering. And God tells us, okay, here's what I want you to do with this. So talking about a king of your life, even if you don't acknowledge God as king, you still have this suffering, right? It rains on the just and the unjust, right? So it's going to happen anyway. God says, here's how I want you to handle it. And he even, he doesn't answer all our little questions, but he does give us an insight into why some of this happens. He doesn't answer all those questions, and that's kind of the classic. If you're talking to somebody about Christianity, and you're likely to get that question. Well, why does God allow this suffering? And there are decent answers for that, I guess, but it's certainly not dotting all the I's and answering every little question. But God does talk to us a little bit here about why the suffering happens, and we definitely hit that pretty good last week, but there are a few things we didn't get to, so we'll kind of review it and add some things to it. But I wanted to also start, before we get into the kings and suffering any more than we have, I thought Mark had an interesting write-up in today's bulletin. I don't know if you read it yet. I sometimes read it ahead of time because you get that little email PDF. And I thought this was really neat for us being here in Bible class today. The second paragraph says, we're warned about those who forget the God that saved them. do you forget the God that saved you? And in Psalm 106 it says, they did not believe his promise. They grumbled in their tents and did not obey the Lord. They did not believe his promise. They grumbled in their tents and did not obey the Lord. So I think if we kind of pull that a little bit forward and just talk about attending Bible studies and worship and coming to church to meet with the saints, right? So this has been a big thing since COVID, right? You know, who's coming back? When are you coming back? Do I have to come back? You know, can a Christian be a Christian in isolation? You know, and should we meet with the church? So I kind of think about they grumbled in their tents. To me, that means, you know, kind of staying home, not coming back. And they did not obey the Lord. But I think it's interesting. I'll point it back to myself. So if you stay home from church, you don't gather with the saints, you didn't stay home and do this other wonderful thing instead. You know, what it says here is they stayed home and they grumbled. So it's like, yeah, okay, this morning we lost that hour. I stayed up super late and didn't remember that I lost the hour until I went to set my alarm, went to bed. You know, the phone will tell you how much sleep you're getting. And I put it in. I was, whoa, I didn't stay up that late. It's like, I lost the hour. So, you know, I was like, Nawan and I were laying in bed, and she was like, maybe we skip Bible class, sleep in a little more. I said, well, I'm teaching Bible class, so I can't do that. But I think of yourself, think of maybe some people you know. You stay home from church, and you stay home, and you think it's going to be this great thing, but you just sit there and kind of grumble. I think that's an interesting perspective. Okay, you skip church, but what are you doing instead? Are you having this great adventure, you know, instead? Or did I sleep an extra hour, turn on the TV, you know, and then, church is over, you know. So think about that. We all know that God saved us. And he's told us that he wants us to gather together and that we need to gather together. And think about the times that you do skip. Are you just doing what they're talking about here in Psalms? You stay in your tent and grumble, right? So you really chose the right thing by being here. Even outside of a church situation, maybe you're getting sick of work, so you decide, I'm taking a day off. And you take the day off and you sit at home and you think about how bad work is, right? So something we don't necessarily want to fall into there. Got a question about suffering here in a minute, but we've covered a few things. Any comments or something you wanted to bring up? Something I missed maybe that you want to send out there? Talked a little bit about who's the king of your life. That suffering or that rain falls on everybody. It's how we're going to deal with it. We're going to trust God that he has a reason for this, even though we don't understand it all, right? Well, how does it feel to worship a God that promises you suffering? And we're getting into a political season, right? And I don't hear the politicians who want to be elected or reelected promising suffering, right? What are they promising? The schools will be fixed, no new taxes, all the wars are going to end. You know, so we're getting these positive promises. Well, I mean, you're here today. You didn't sleep in. You're here to honor God. How do you feel about honoring or worshiping a God that says you're going to suffer? I mean, I think that's something that we have to come to face with. It would be hard to be asked by someone maybe who's not a Christian, well, why do you honor this God who did this to you? Who, you know, you lost your loved one. You lost your job. Why do you honor a God like this? You know, I think that's a great question, and it's a real one. How does it feel that you worship and honor a God who promises you suffering? Can't you find a God that's not going to do that? Maybe we're so used to it. Usually I don't let you off the hook, but if I don't ask a very specific question, I will possibly let you off the hook. That's a real general one. So let me read over a little bit of this 2 Corinthians, chapter 1, verse 3. God telling us about suffering. We did talk about this some last week. Praise be to the God and the Father, Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort. That kind of goes against this, right? He promises us suffering. But praise be to the God, the Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those that are having trouble, since we ourselves have been comforted by God. So we hit this kind of hard last week, but one of the reasons that we suffer through things is so that we can comfort others. You know, we've all been through different things. If I have a friend who's been through a terrible divorce and custody battle, and he's been through it, and then somebody comes to me and says, oh, I'm having this terrible problem, I want to introduce those two people, because the person who's been through that suffering and come out the other side because of the God of all comfort has a lot to offer that person that I don't. So one of the reasons that we suffer and struggle is so we can comfort others as God comforts us. And that's a lot. That sounds nice. That fits into the worldview I was brought up in. Okay, I'm going to struggle so later I can help someone else. Okay. But boy, when you're in the middle of it, it's a different deal, isn't it? I see some heads nodding. Easy to say, but it's also the truth. And again, that suffering is going to happen anyway to everyone. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. So God's telling us here the healthy way to handle that stuff. You know, I actually don't think I've had tons and tons of suffering in my life. One thing I do struggle with sometimes is these massive headaches for like a 4-month period every couple of years. And since they come up every couple of years, I try to prepare a little bit for them. Because I love the songs, you know, where you're praising God when things are great and when things are horrible. So I'm coming into it, like, all right, I'm definitely going to, like, this is something God has for me. You know, I'm trying to fix it, taking the medicine and all, but, you know, here it comes. So I'm having this headache, and I'm going into it. I'm in my head, I'm like, oh, I'm going to pray. I'm going to, you know, honor you, praise you through this. But, man, an hour and a half into it, I'm literally telling God, okay, if you had your fun, I'm good, you know, like not kidding, you know. So, you know, God is a big boy. He's heard it all, and I would counsel talking to him like you're feeling, and that's gonna be a help. But, so we hear one of the reasons that we suffer is so we can help others. Is that good enough for you? Again, though, the suffering is going to happen anyway. We suffer to help others. We share in Christ's suffering so we can also share in his comfort. Any thoughts on suffering? Because I know that everybody in here has been through it in some way. How does what God says about being the God of all comfort, fit with this? And is it related a little bit to, you know, who's in charge of your life? Is the king of your life you? Is the king of your life God? Or do you let him be king sometimes and kind of take it back when you feel like he can't handle that? Becky.
I'm not going to quote it correctly. I don't remember, but I think it's been in the bulletin a time or two. It's from Tim Keller. It's right now are exactly what you would ask God for if you knew everything that God knows. So if the end result of your suffering is to help others, if the end result of your suffering is to grow you into the likeness of Christ as a mature Christian, that's the end result that you would want. So if you knew in advance that this is God's ultimate, aim for you, that's exactly what you would ask for. And
I get it.
it's almost circular thinking. It's hard to get your mind around,
Mhm.
but we have to keep in mind,
Mm.
the end result. If we allow God, to
Yeah. It's definitely countercultural thinking. Yes, sir.
I think also the suffering is to understand and find the meaning in the suffering. I think suffering is the growth. Like you said, an example, your growth of your purpose to help somebody. I think, there's times that the suffering is, you can't understand, like, why these babies die. You can't, that's why they suffer. And you try to find meaning in that, but that's not our place to find. But like there's little suffering, like a small example, like me and Carmen grew up differently, and this one's not funny, but like I didn't do certain, I was blessed enough to do certain chores, but she grew up differently, but was able to do the chores, and to me that's suffering. I'm not gonna lie, but I was able, but because of what she went through, she taught me things to understand how to do things, certain things I was not able to do because I didn't go through that. So I mean, like, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
It's different when she's sitting next to you, right?
I'm trying to say is as growth. As
Right.
Growth, the suffering part. That's what I was trying to say.
Right.
I went a little long.
Right.
I think about the Bible verse when it talks about finding comfort in that suffering because we're kind of learning through the model of loving Christ and the compassion through that suffering. And so when you have God with you through that suffering and you're able then to be an example of that comfort and compassion, if you have God with you and you understand that process, then can you turn around and be compassionate and comfort through Christ. And that itself just finds so much more meaning. And for me at least, I find comfort in that, to know that. And I always ask myself, why am I always going through this? And what I've realized as I continue on, that this struggles or something that I've encountered in my life, it's not to my glory, but to the glory of God. And to be an example of Him to others as I model and I support that and comfort them. And if I, through Him, acknowledge Him in the works that I do with others, His compassion, His love, then my suffering wasn't in vain.
Yeah. Well put. Thank you. Sean, go ahead.
I agree. I think that's great, but also, come back to me. I gotta organize.
We're going to give you another chance in a few minutes, guys, for sharing some stories you might have about suffering and struggles. In Psalm 103, it says, "As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear Him." Why? For He knows how we were formed. He remembers that we are dust. So God doesn't always tell us why, but He tells us a little bit here that the Lord has compassion on those who fear Him. For He knows how we were formed. He remembers that we are dust. It kind of reminds me of somebody who might say to a younger person, "Don't talk to me that way. I changed your diapers, buddy." You remember when that person was not who he is today. And God tells us this, that He has compassion on us because He knows where we came from. He remembers that we are dust. God often compares Himself to a parent, and us being the children. And there's a lot of a lot that comes with that. Because your children, if God's the parent and we're the children can embarrass you, right? I mean, the children say, I have a lot, the way they act, it has a lot to do with how people view you and your family and all that. So, God making us his children, he's turned over the representation of him to others. I mean, we're epistles, we're letters to the world from God. And as his children, we represent him, and we can make him look good, right? Or we can embarrass him, and I bet your kids have done both to you, and God's children have done that to him. So God continues, he compares us to his children. So God's compassion is compared to a parent's compassion on their children. God remembers we are dust. Our earthly parents remember when they were changing our diapers, right? So think about your own children if you have them. What do you want to spare them? And what do you want them to experience? So God, spare me from this. But your child might say the same thing. But you want him or her to experience something because you know it's going to help them later. So being the parent helps us understand God a little bit, right? So God, why are we suffering? We have some answers, but not all of them. But if we put ourselves in the parental role, we want our children to go through certain things because we know they're going to need it in life. And that kind of comes back to a little bit of what Becky said about if we knew what God knew, we would choose the suffering that we have, which, it's countercultural, but there's truth to it. Anything you could think of that was hard to watch your kids go through, but you kind of knew they had to get over that hump? God's telling us to compare ourselves, to call him Father, a parent. And he says, you can relate to that a little bit because of your kids. Anything you could think of that you saw your kids go through or you let them go through that you knew they needed to, even though maybe you could have saved them from that? Yes, ma'am.
If you ask Sean, he will tell you that I am the parent more likely to allow my children to get hurt. And it is for that exact reason. Because our oldest believes that he knows what's going on. He has great ideas. He thinks he's got it figured out. And when I say things to him like, Jordan, I don't think that's a good idea because this is what is going to happen. And then he goes ahead and he does it and he gets physically hurt. He brought it upon himself, which we often do as Christians. And yet it hurts me as a parent to have to watch him go through it. But I know it's going to be beneficial for him. So it gives me the perspective. Now that I'm a parent, I feel like I can understand God so much more. Because I can recognize that who am I to decide that I know what is best when I did not create the universe. I did not, die on the cross for the entire world's sins. And so it gives me a perspective of humbleness because I can now see a bigger part of the picture even though it's still a minuscule picture. It's enabling me to grow and to help my children, which helps me and helps everyone else.
Right. So almost like, kind of reminds me, even though Job was apparently an incredible person, which, brought, Job was even brought to God's attention, right, and to Satan's attention. He got into a lot of trouble for being such a great person. But maybe that was something that Job needed to understand too, because in the end, Job had questions to God about why he was suffering so badly. And God's answer was, because I'm God. Basically, he goes through chapters of telling Job all the wonderful things that God has done. And do you tell the ocean where to stop? Did you set the stars in place? You know, they're just things, and you know, some personality types, it's easier to accept that than others. But yeah, great point. Thank you. Somebody else, anything you saw or let your children go through that you could have saved them from, but you didn't because you knew that suffering was going to produce a better person? Anybody else? Yeah. You need to. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
So with my daughter going to, we first started went to doing Mary Bray when she was young. And she first went to BCC, which is a dominant minority school. Then she went to Mary Bray. My age from at that time was 90% Caucasian, 94%. And so what happened was, for her, so when she started going to that school, being that I grew up in the suburbs, I dealt with being the only person. And so at that time when she was going, I was so overprotective. I was like, I was just fearing I wanted to protect her from everything. I didn't want her to deal with what I had to go through. I was just so overprotective. But understanding that was my plan. I had my plan for her, but really God had his plan for her. And what Carmen helped me with was to let her, she'll be okay. Just don't be overprotective. Don't think that she don't go through what you went through as a kid when you're growing up in a different, diverse, non-diverse situation. And to let God lead her and understand that God has a plan. And that helped me, and it worked out in the benefit because I kept her in that bubble. Be careful, this, and this. This is what I did, this is what I got called, this is what I went through. But it was Carmen who said, no, she has to let God do this. Let God, she'll be okay. In reality, she's okay. She flourished. She met a lot of different people, and it helped me as well as a parent to understand that you can't baby them, you can't keep them in a bubble. They have to go through certain things. And that helped me out a lot to realize that I had to let go of that. And just because I went through it doesn't mean she was going to go through it.
Yeah. And if we can understand that at our basic level, we can understand a little bit what God allows us to suffer through and a little bit of a why. Mom got me once, like I was thinking kindergarten, first grade, and talking about letting someone suffer, a little bit different. I don't know if you remember this, Mom. So, I mean, I was into, I'm a young boy, and I'm watching TV, and, I'm the superhero, and I could beat anybody up, and, the bully got, all this stuff, and I guess I was talking about it a lot, how I could beat anybody up. I'm stronger than anybody, and I fully believed it. I still do. So I think Mom, and I'm putting myself in her shoes, I think Mom became a little afraid that I would do something that would get me into trouble if I thought I was this strong and all-powerful as maybe your son, I don't know. And so she was cooking in there, and I was watching TV, and I watched this boxing thing, and I was just in there boxing, and I was just the best. And Mom came in and said, you really can't beat anybody up. You got to realize there are people stronger than you. You're going to get in trouble. And no, Mom. So she said, do you want to wrestle? And I said, this woman wants to wrestle me. And believe it or not, Mom pinned me right down. Just pinned me down as I was crying and pushing and yelling. And she's, do you see that you can't beat anybody up? And I was pretty mad, but it was a lesson you need to know, right? Because truthfully, you can't. And you're going to get yourself in trouble if you think these crazy things. And part of suffering is a humbling thing, right? That you have no control over this. A time that you were suffering, maybe a lost job, whatever it is, did you find yourself closer or farther from God during that suffering? You can definitely answer out loud if you want, but I want you to at least answer in your head, did that struggle, did that suffering, that time, bring you closer to God or make you distant from Him? Yes, Mommy. After beating me up, humiliating me, go ahead. I can take you now, though. Was
I was crying out
And in a way, he answered your prayer before you even prayed it, because this person or company was developing this medicine that was going to work for you long before you prayed for that relief. Interesting. I know that's not your main point, but yes, honoring God for his healing. So answer it out loud or to yourself if you want, but truthfully, when you're struggling and suffering, are you closer to God or further from God? And what is God's ultimate goal for you? God's ultimate goal is that you're closer to him. And if that means that he's going to make you struggle and suffer to get closer to him, that's all he cares about, is you being close to him, being saved. And he's going to do whatever it takes in our lives, and that's scary to think about, to bring you to him. Yeah, we'll go there and then here again.
I've experienced periods of both. When Sean and I were first married, we tried for 6 years to have children naturally. And during that time, there was nothing wrong with either one of us, but it wasn't happening, and I didn't understand why. And then just last year, when I had a miscarriage, early on in our marriage, and we're struggling to have children, I felt distant from God because I couldn't comprehend why. Then later on, just recently last year, when I had a miscarriage, I felt closer to God. And I recognize now that the difference in those two experiences was my own immaturity, my own lack of roots in God's Word, in my relationship with God, because when I had a miscarriage, I didn't have to know why. When I was struggling to have children, I desperately wanted to know why, and there were no answers. And yet, I was able to come to a point with the miscarriage that I didn't need to know why. And yet, I was still comforted.
Comfort. Thanks for sharing that. And going through that will help you comfort another person who's struggling with that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, her remarks actually almost answered my idea. We want to be closer to him. We can't always get closer to him because we don't know what we're experiencing.
Okay, yeah.
We have to work on that to find it, to give us some understanding of what's going on.
Well put. Thank you. We'll wrap up in about 5 minutes here. It's a little story. It's called Is Your Hut Burning? The only survivor of a shipwreck was washed up on an uninhabited island. He prayed fervently for God to rescue him, and every day he scanned the horizon for help, but none seemed forthcoming. Exhausted, he eventually managed to build a little hut out of driftwood to protect him from the elements and to store his few possessions. But then one day, after scavenging for food, he arrived home to find his hut in flames. The smoke rolled up into the sky. The worst thing had happened. Everything was lost. He was stunned with grief and anger and said, God, why didn't you save my hut? It's all I had left. You're taking everything from me. And he despaired. So early the next day, however, he was awakened by the sound of a ship that was approaching the island. It had come to rescue him. How did you know I was here? Asked the weary man to his rescuers. And they said, well, we saw your smoke signal. So, this is what we've been talking about the whole time. We don't know God's ultimate stuff here. Can you think of a time when something looked bad at first and it turned out good? A breakup? Boy, I'm glad I didn't end up with that person. A job loss? Wow, my job now is so much better. I bet you can. I bet you can. Just as we wrap up, 2 or 3 minutes here. So I think that we've run through last week and this week the suffering thing, and we'll put our suffering aside, right? As we kind of wrap up talking about the kings there, a lot of our suffering is going to be, how we handle our suffering is very related to who's the king of our life. We talked about earthly kings. There are kings in our world now who really are kings and in charge and have all the power. Then we have kings like the King of England, who is really ceremonial. And we're choosing the kind of God, the kind of king that we're going to make God. Okay, is God a ceremonial king? We like to go around, yes, God is my king, but we really don't give him any power in our lives. Or is he the real king who's really in charge? Or maybe more commonly, we have kings that they're called parliamentary kings in the world, and they have some power, but it has to be ratified by what they say has to be ratified by Parliament. So there's these kings, and God is the king, right? And is God a ceremonial king who, I just call myself a Christian, and yeah, okay, he's just ceremonial. Like the King of England. It's kind of cool. King of England's kind of cool to have a monarchy, but no power. Or is God this absolute king of your life, almost like the real king with real power, and you can't take it back when you want it? He is king. Or is he more likely this parliamentary king? He's a king that has power if we give it to him, right? Okay, I have a decision. I know what the scripture says. I know what my Christian friends counsel me, but I want to do this instead. So you're talking about a king who you can give and take power from, that parliamentary king. We're the parliament, and the king has a decree, and we're deciding whether or not we're going to let that decree go through. So our suffering and how we handle it is largely based on who is king of our lives. Now again, God's king whether we like it or not, but he gives us that free will to make him the real king, or the parliamentary king, or the ceremonial king. So as we wrap up, I'll say that the intensity and degree and meaningfulness of our suffering has a lot to do with who's the king of our lives. And for a lot of people, maybe some of us included, you're your own king, right? Well, I appreciate discussing these things with you. They are, if you want to read 1 Samuel at your leisure, that's where God wanted to be the king of Israel and not have an earthly king. But the Israelites, who often represent us, wanted a real physical king. And God said, well, if you get a real physical king, the king is going to demand all these things from you. Are you sure you want that? And they're like, yes, we just want a king. So give that a read, and it has a lot. It does connect with when we want to be we want to be a king in our lives rather than God, and the suffering that's going to come along with that. So I appreciate your time. God bless, and I'll see you in worship service.